those stories that we used to see as being the soft stories have become the stories that all correspondents cover now. The people affected by the winds of change and the winds of war, they're the ones that we care about now. And so all correspondents, male and female, are more likely to be covering the story of the people sheltering from the bombs in the basement rather than the name of the general who ordered the bombardment or the number, the serial number on the ordnance. And I think that's a really important and personal, that's a really important thing, that we're personalising the real stories of real people.
Welcome to Be Human, Melissa.
Thank you very much for having me, Jennah-louise.
So Melissa, where I want to start is with a part in your new book, Through Her Eyes. And it was actually a personal part to you, which made me have a little giggle. You describe yourself as ever the optimist. And in this part of the book, you share your personal story of being in India in the 80s. And you were on a plane with your husband, Trevor. And essentially, the plane began to catch on fire. And you look to Trevor and you say, that's normal, right? And it kind of it was an interesting side of you to share, because I do wonder, Melissa, did you grow up, were you born with sort of this perspective of optimism, or is it sort of something that you've built over time through the experiences that you've had in life?
Yeah, I think possibly I've always been pretty optimistic and expect the best of people. And I find that usually if you do think the best of others, you usually get that back. Obviously, not always, but it's a pretty good way to be. I guess in a way the downside of it is that the danger is that I think things will go on like this always. And perhaps that means that you don't grasp the moment as much as you possibly could if you think, oh, all this is going to fall away, I better enjoy it while it's here. But I think being an optimist has given me a pretty good life.
Yeah, it was a funny story to share, and it was interesting because you were sort of saying, I sort of assumed optimistically that maybe because the plane was old, that, it was just sort of burning off some fuel. And it just really gave me a beautiful insight to the way that you see life. And I think that certainly it's something that we can sort of all learn from, and I'm sure is kind of influenced your sense of achievement and the experiences that you've had up until now. And I want to kind of delve more into this story of India, because in your book you share different stories from different female correspondents. What had you decide to share this story based in India from all the experiences that you have had?
It was an early experience for me. It was my first foreign posting. It's how I started out as a freelancer, paying my own way there, not being posted. But I got a gig writing for The Australian. Piers Ackerman, who is quite a larger-than-life figure in the Australian media, took a punt on me. And he mentored me later on and taught me a lot about writing. And I had this opportunity in India, and it came at a time when India was just on the cusp of changing very dramatically towards becoming the country it is today. And it was kind of the end of a long period for India. And so it was a sort of a magical time to be there. It was like having an insight into a period of history that was about to go forever. Wow. So it was just a marvelous time.
It sounds absolutely marvelous. And I'd love to sort of talk to you about marvelous experiences. In being a journalist, you've obviously had a variety of experiences, certainly on the spectrum from marvelous to, I can only assume there's sort of been some challenging times in there also. Can you share a story sort of around a moment in your life where you had the reflection of like, yeah, this is exactly why I'm a journalist?
I guess I became a journalist for a few reasons. One of them is because I love to write, and and that's a sort of good way of being a writer for a living. But more deeply than that, I think, and also on the shallow side, I guess, to have a life of adventure, which it
Yeah,
delivers in
beautiful.
spades. But also because you have an opportunity to affect change. You've got an opportunity to provide people with information and knowledge is power. So that enables people to understand their world and then act on it with that, armed with that information, and maybe even to draw things to attention that they can then care about and maybe work on.
And in this life of adventure, to my understanding, obviously every individual is different, but some sort of err on the side of wanting more and more of this adventure. And I would say almost this adrenaline infused kind of experience that can come with journalism. And some people sort of like these sort of shorter term postings where they can sort of be immersed in the experience and then sort of come home to integrate. Where do you sort of fall on that line?
Um, I love to be immersed in the country. So
Mm.
when Trevor and I, my husband Trevor Watson, who's the co-author of Through Her Eyes, he was for many years the ABC correspondent. And so he would be posted to these places, and we were a bit of a double act, He would be posted, and then I'd go there and freelance, and I'd pick up these sort of amazing opportunities to work. I worked for Time Magazine in China. I mean,
Wow.
that was extraordinary.
Yeah.
I picked up Newsweek later after that, and then eventually came back here to be Newsweek correspondent. So we would go for these long-term postings to countries and really try and get involved in that country and try and understand it more, read as much as we could, meet people, and try and learn a little bit about it so that would be able to inform how we wrote.
And what is that like having a husband, being in a relationship of two correspondents? Do you feel like that has made this choice of career easier for you both? Or is there sort of like a hindrance that comes with having sort of the same career path?
No, there's no hindrance at all. I mean, we've always worked really closely together, and that's and I think that we enjoy each other's company. We'd better we
You have to.
time sitting across the desk staring at each other.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really been sort of a powerful aspect of our relationship, working together and firing off each other. We are very different in many ways. We have different views on some of the big questions, but that's interesting. I guess that's the
Yeah.
spice of life. But it has been good.
Yeah, absolutely. That completely makes sense, just being in a relationship. I mean, I think that's why we're drawn to people, isn't it? To kind of be able to share those differences. But it's beautiful that you're also sort of able to share that experience of adventure and writing that you've both chosen. And obviously, this kind of brings us into the book that you have both written together, Through Her Eyes. And I kind of want to take a turn more into the context of this book. And I want to sort of start with, I assume, sort of the purpose behind this book was to highlight the struggle for women to sort of take what you sort of share, quote unquote, their rightful place in the once male-dominated media industry. Can you share and speak more to why you decided to write a book on this?
Well, women journalists, now you see women journalists everywhere. They're interviewing the heads of government. They're on the front line covering wars. They're in Ukraine at the moment. They're they're everywhere, and they're doing a fantastic job, the equal of anyone. But it wasn't always like this. Women often were they were often confined to what were called the soft stories. So again, in World War II, it wasn't permissible for women to go to the front line. They could only cover the stories at the nurses' station, the wounded soldiers, the refugees, the people who were affected by the big stories. But interestingly, then they took themselves where they needed to go. So women like Lorraine Stum basically talked her way into the big stories, and she got to go to Papua New Guinea and to the Kokoda Trail. She got to cover the bombing of Hiroshima because she kind of worked her way in there and made her own way. She wasn't paid, her way wasn't paid by a big news organization. But gradually over time, those stories that we used to see as being the soft stories have become the stories that all correspondents cover now. The people affected by the winds of change and the winds of war, they're the ones that we care about now. And so all correspondents, male and female, are more likely to be covering the story of the people sheltering from the bombs in the basement rather than the name of the general who ordered the bombardment or the number, the serial number on the ordnance. And I think that's a really important and personal, that's a really important thing, that we're personalising the real stories of real people in the news.
And why do you personally think that it was initially sort of this male-dominated industry, and what has sort of been the influence to kind of bring it up to date where, as you shared, there are a lot more women sort of being correspondents now in different sort of contexts, whether it be sort of war or etc.?
Well, Trevor has a funny line. He says, journalists are just like everybody else, only more so. So when, back in the 70s and the 50s, when sexism was rampant, the sexism in the media was ugly. He says he heard a lot of gendered violent insults against women that he won't repeat. It was a grim kind of time. Women had to be very, very tough to get ahead. I think that with feminism, that changed over time. Women had more faith in themselves, moved forward, and men have benefited from feminism as well, and they've made space for women to move into the media, which is really important. And I think also it's important that it's not just gender equality that we see, that we're seeing now more of a push for people of all kinds of backgrounds to move into the media. We're hearing a lot more from people who aren't necessarily Anglo and middle class, like many of us have been coming through in the past. We're now seeing people who are fundamentally deeply Australian, but who come from different family backgrounds, and they can bring new insights into the coverage of news and bringing that Australian story back to Australian listeners and readers.
And what do you think is the resulting influence of sort of having this change of women coming in and being represented a lot more and bringing in more of these stories of a human aspect of sort of bringing in more than just fact, but emotion and compassion and empathy? What do you think the resulting influence on people that are watching, reading, listening to these stories is?
Look, I think that the women who have contributed to this book are all really very powerful personalities. They're tough, they're resourceful, they're clever, they're talented. But one thing that shines through for me with every single one of them is their concern about the the real people that they're interviewing and the real stories that they're telling. I was talking to Kirsty Needham, who writes a really exciting story about the pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong. But she was really concerned about the Mothers for Democracy who were on the street. And while she had a flak jacket and a gas mask, they just had, they were sheltering from tear gas with just, one of those surgical masks that we've been wearing to protect ourselves from COVID. She was also really concerned about the locally employed correspondents who have to stay in the hot zone when we all get to go home. So what has come through is that real concern for real people. Barbara Miller still worries about the people that she interviewed years ago who'd streamed out of Syria in refugee convoys. Sophie McNeill now works in human rights. She put down her work to take care of an elderly man a Syrian who'd fled, and he'd been separated from his wife and children. He was all alone on a beach in Greece, and he was silently weeping. And she knew that if she didn't do something about him, there was no way that he could have walked to the refugee camp. He may well have died. So she took him under her wing. She managed to do all of her work around getting him to the refugee camp, getting him to the Red Cross, and finally making sure that somebody would care for him until he made it all the way to Germany. I think that's really so impressive. And I just see that time and time again with all of these women who have written for this book.
And in the journalistic practice, is this something that you learn, or is it very personal to be able to make these decisions when out in environments like that, between the pressure of sort of getting a story out there, but also very much being a human around other humans that are going through challenging circumstances?
There's very little training in how to be a foreign correspondent. I mean, in my day, it was very much on the job training, a bit more like a trade, I guess, than a profession. These days, journalists are taught about how to keep safe in chaotic situations. They receive a lot of security training. And I guess more and more as journalism goes into university, you talk more and more about these kind of issues. But I think with these women, it is just something that's innate with them, that they are caring individuals, as well as being tough and talented. They just really give a damn about the people whose stories that they follow.
And in your book, you speak to the struggles and sort of issues that women still face. You describe sort of from vicious media trolling to threats of sexual violence. Can you share more about where women are with that at the present moment?
Well, Lynn O'Donnell, who was bureau chief for the AP and for UPI, an Australian woman who's really a storied correspondent, became a high-value target of the Taliban. So she faced quite a lot of risk returning to Afghanistan quite recently. But I think of Sue Lin Wong, who's a very, I think, an important young journalist who's going to go a very long way and currently working for the Economist in Asia. She's Australian, born in Sydney, attended ANU. Her parents were born and grew up in Malaysia. But Chinese nationalists believe that because she's ethnically Chinese, she should support the Communist Party and support the leadership of Xi Jinping, and basically never say a word against the leadership of China, and was quite viciously trolled, called a race traitor. And she and her fellow correspondents who do have Chinese ethnic backgrounds were trading concepts on how to stay safe online and in real life when these people put your address out there. So it can be very frightening, particularly for young women who are very outspoken and who have a real social media presence these days.
Mm. And not only do you sort of speak to women in media, but I listened to a recent radio interview you did, and you speak also to diversity. Can you share more about your opinion on not only sort of advocating for obviously women in media, but also for diverse communities?
Look, I think that the purpose of having Australians overseas as foreign correspondents is so that we have people who can insightfully talk to fellow Australians about what's going on overseas. But that's not enough. I mean, if you're only listening to men, for instance, you're only hearing about half the stories. If you're only talking about men, you're only learning about half the stories. But it's not just enough to only have women. You need to have people from different ethnic backgrounds, from communities who are diverse, like linguistically. But it's also, maybe it's more important to have a whole range of diverse people out there who can bring new insights and new ideas. And I think the more that we have Indigenous correspondents, the more that we have diverse correspondents in all different aspects of life, the better our journalism will be.
And in terms of women and people from diverse backgrounds getting into journalism, do you have any personal advice for these people? Is there equal opportunity now, or is there still things that people need to sort of approach this area of interest differently?
Look, I think that even in this day and age, a lot of management is still heavily male. Like in any business, women are very visible in the middle, but not quite so much on the top. And I think we're only just seeing more diverse groups of people coming through now. But I think you just have to roll up your sleeves and get into it. And people will receive a lot of knockbacks. So, they really need to be very resilient. And that's a big ask. I know it's easy for me to say, well, just be resilient. But I think that you have to be tough and you have to be driven, and you have to care as well as being skilled. So you've got to try and work on all those different things. Big ask.
And in terms of sort of resilience and staying the path, how does that sort of look like in terms of self-talk for you when you were sort of getting into the industry early on?
Oh, yeah. I think in the old days, a lot of women used to probably drink a lot. Not something that I've ever done, but I think people would go through some terrible things. I know that Kate Webb went through, who was UPI bureau chief in Cambodia. She was actually captured by the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War, declared dead, and walked out of the jungle, much to everybody's surprise. And I think that she got through what had happened to her with a bit of self-medicating. I hope that's not too unkind to say. I think that self-talk issue that you bring up is really very important. I mean, funny story. When we were putting this book together, we approached a lot of journalists, a lot of really quality Australian women journalists. Many of them said, "Why me? why would you want to hear from me? And the answer was, because you're one of Australia's finest foreign correspondents. When we were doing our previous book, The Beijing Bureau, which is a similar book, it's the story of foreign correspondents who've covered China. None of the men asked why me. They said, how many words do you want? And then they said, is that all? Can't I write more? So they had a lot more self-belief, I think, than some of these women. But when we said, we really want you to be involved in this and you are going to be great, they rose to the occasion. And the stories in this book, I think, are spectacular. Just recently, I was asked by our publisher, Hardy Grant, to lead an In Conversation with Clive Hamilton, who's just written his autobiography, Provocateur, as a former China correspondent, because he's sort of well known as having written Silent Invasion on the Chinese Communist Party. And that's what I said. I said, why me? You know, where is the nearest bushel? I need to hide my light under it. And I pulled myself up and I said to myself, this is exactly what you saw all those other women correspondents doing, that you were disappointed and then you did it yourself. So I instantly said I would be honoured and proud to do it. And it went so well. It was great. So I shouldn't have been worried.
That's incredibly fascinating. Why do you think that is? Is it just like, do you think that's changing? Do you think women that are coming up in media now, obviously with more opportunity, is there better self-talk, or is it still something that's very present amongst women in media in general?
I think that it's improving. The younger ones were a lot more determined to tell their own story. And I think that I just think with some of the older women, it's the way that you were raised.
Yeah.
You know, we were raised to not sing our own praises, to not be loud. Another example was Diane Willman, who is really not as well known now amongst sort of younger people, but when I was growing up, she was an amazing role model. She had freelanced from the Middle East in the 70s. She went over there in 1969. She approached the ABC to be a foreign correspondent in Beirut, and they said to her, why would we send you? You'll get married and have a baby, and then where will we be? And so she paid her own way, freelanced. The ABC picked her up as a freelancer, and sure, she had a baby over there, Tarek. She put him under a mattress when during the bombardments, and went on and covered this big story. And I can remember her on the radio, and she was one of the people who made me want to be a foreign correspondent.
Wow.
And I had to tell her that story when she said to me, why on earth would you want me in your book? So I said, well, because you're an inspiration to young journalists. So I think it's changing, which is a good thing.
Yeah. And what would you say to maybe, you know, if there's a younger you that's here to be inspired about thinking about the potentiality of getting into correspondent work, what's a little piece of advice that you would share in terms of being more confident, being more honoured in being part of such an industry?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think it's important to speak up. I guess back in the day when we wanted to get somewhere, you could either barge through, which many women did very successfully, and that's a great way of doing it. I found that I would sort of charm my way through, and that seemed to get me where I needed to be. I think that just being very straightforward is the way to go these days.
Well, thank you for this beautiful conversation, Melissa, and thank you for being the co-author with your husband of a very important book. I certainly learned a lot, so thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you.
I'd love to ask you, Melissa, on a final note, what does it mean to you to be human?
To be human is to love, really. And I've been very lucky with my family, and I love a lot, and I am loved in return.